Okay, just wanted to spend a little bit of time today to give you a short video on some background information for business ethics. We're getting closer to where we need to be concerned with the individual project and so forth. This is something that hopefully will start to add some dimension to what you've been reviewing and reading and so forth. So we've done some things with group behavior, which is chapter 9 in the text, and we had the opportunity to watch the video behind the swoosh and so forth. And, when we start to talk about, organizations and ethical values and so forth, and this kind of segues into Barry Barnes and the Grateful Dead, which we'll talk about in another video. But this starts to raise the specter of different questions and different theories and different understandings. In one of the early videos, I think I mentioned that typically ethics is something that most classes turn into a free for all. What do you think about this? And is that ethical? Well, be ethical because it's immoral, or it wouldn't be moral because and so forth, which is a bit nonsensical. So we're going to put some perspective to that today. And if the technology works, let me see if I can share screen. And we'll start with this. This is a presentation that I've used before. And it speaks to various aspects, but gives us an underpinning of some of the aspects of business ethics. So, for starters, uh, business ethics and public opinion. So, we'll chat a little bit about that or weave some of that in. What business ethics actually means, because again, ask 10 people, get 10 different views or answers. Ethics, economics, the law, and I almost hate to do it because of certain politicians that absolutely love Venn diagrams. But there is a Venn diagram or slide in this PowerPoint deck, which you'll see soon enough, and so forth. So different models of management ethics and making moral management actionable decisions. But again, what does that mean? Developing moral judgment, another one of those things, sounds good when you say it fast, and so forth. So, business ethics, the public's interest in business ethics has obviously been increased not only in the last 4 decades, but probably actually since the Depression, which was back in 1929, 30, and so forth. And it's gained traction because of a lot of the media attention and coverage. Most recently, we saw the failings of a bank in, I guess, the West Coast, that SVG Savings or whatever the name of that bank is. And, there's, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there is this risk reward perspective that comes into play for investing and investments. There's a lot of investment knowledge that comes into laddering portfolios and duration and things like that. And all of that played into the decision making that ultimately resulted in the failure of this bank. Now, to bail out the bank or not bail out the bank, well, that becomes an issue. And that's not for our discussion purposes today because it entertains an entire underpinning of knowledge that surrounds the notion of risk reward and duration and investment and so on and so forth, probably which we don't all, have or share. So let's limit it to the idea that the public's interest in what we seem to refer to as business ethics has certainly increased, certainly in acuity. And it's been brought forefront by media outlets that generate sharp focus in this area. So, as a somewhat short inventory, so to speak, of ethical issues in business, well, you have employee employer relations. You have the reverse of that, employer employee relations, and everything that might entail. Company customer relations, company shareholder relations, company the general public, so to speak, relations or interests, and so forth. Put differently, you have the different stakeholder groups that come into play. And, the idea of somehow accepting that all the various stakeholder groups share an equal position is simply not true. And Michael Moffat teaches us that there are various and varying forms of capitalism. And this American or Western brand of capitalism, whether it's good, bad, right, or wrong, is a separate discussion. But this brand of capitalism puts the owners of the firm, the shareholders, above all other stakeholder groups, and that's done by the business judgment rule and others. Now, that's not always universally accepted because the knowledge in that area is kind of lacking. We just have a perspective that firms ought to act the way we think they ought to act, and it's all intuitive and it makes sense. Well, it's not quite as simple as that. Public's opinion of business ethics. Well, a Gallup poll, somewhat recent, finds that only 17% to 20% of the public thought the business ethics of executives was high or even very high. That's a pretty low rating. Um, you know, who has a lower rate? Well, probably Congress. Everybody hates Congress. 17 to 20%. So, in other words, it appears, at least by virtue of this singular poll, that business and the big shots that run these firms are not very highly thought of by the general populace. Well, then we go further to understand public sentiment towards business ethics. Ask three questions. Has business ethics really deteriorated? And that'll be rhetorical for right now. That's something we'll do in the discussion board. Are the media reporting ethical problems more frequently and vigorously? And again, we would have to be able to back that up, but there is some sense that that may in fact be the case. And are practices that once were socially acceptable no longer socially acceptable? That's a biggie. But again, that falls in many camps. Socially acceptable seems to be a broad brush phrase, and again, there's a lot to unpack. All right. Well, again, you can look at this slide and make some inferences. Society's expectations of business ethics, if you notice, seems to be a lot higher than what some might tag as actual business ethics. So, is it a matter of expectations and realistic expectations? And part of the answer, I think, is probably yes. Government, arguably, although in my mind, not much of an argument, but government, I think, fails on many levels. It is not the purpose in the for-profit arena in publicly traded companies, Western or American capitalism, to worry about, in quotes, clean air, clean water. I mean, I don't know what those things are anyway. What are the metrics for clean water? There are no chunks of debris floating in it. What is the metric? What do we decide clean water is and clean air is? So it's not up to business to generate regulation or self-regulate in these areas. It's up to government to make these decisions. Business in the for-profit arena, Western capitalism, really is singularly channeled toward the end of maximizing shareholder value. Now, I know that the soft science types absolutely bristle at that notion because there's a whole social strata that generates billions of dollars a year in training fees and other. Uh, so people make a lot of money by pursuing the notion that somehow firms are guilty. Guilty of what? Guilty of everything. Dirty air, it's a firm's fault. Dirty water, it's the firm's fault. Unemployment, it's the firm's fault. Too much employment, it's the firm's fault. And you get the idea. Now we're business students. So on the one hand, we're probably sitting back saying, yeah, so that makes sense to me. Hopefully no, but if it does, I'm sorry for you. If we recognize that the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder value, then there must be another layer of responsibility somewhere that is tasked with keeping the planet safe, keeping plastics out of the ocean. I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. The great garbage, what do they call it? Garbage cap or garbage field or whatever in the Pacific. I mean, disgraceful. But here's the point. It's not the firm's responsibility. And this is where that notion of expectations comes into play. Our expectations are way up to here. Actual business ethics is somewhere down here. Well, how did this disparity come to be? Because those tasked with doing what we would expect, the behaviors we would expect, haven't generated the laws, the rules, the enforcement, because they're too busy doing other things. And, I won't tear apart politicians here and now, but I think you generally understand my meaning. Business ethics, what does it really mean? Well, ethics involves a discipline that examines good or bad practices. Now, right away, we're normatizing good, bad, right or wrong. Who is the arbiter of those things? And what are the rules and who generated the rules? And are they right for everyone? And that makes it very complicated, but examines the idea, at least, of good or bad practices within the context of a moral duty, whatever that might mean. Moral conduct is behavior that is, in quotes, right or wrong. Again, sounds good when you say it fast, but who really is the arbiter of right or wrong, good or bad? Business ethics include practices and behaviors that are good or bad. And again, according to whom? By what set of rules? Under what theory? These are the complicating factors. Two key branches of ethics, typically descriptive ethics, involves describing, characterizing, and studying morality. What is it? Normative ethics involves supplying and justifying moral systems. What should be? So, what is it or what is versus what should be? Another complicating factor, but as long as we're thinking, something called the fallacy of shoulds. And a fallacy of shoulds argument is basically an argument entertained under the notion, if not theory, that somehow something else should be the way things are. That company should do this. This agency should behave this way. That, I don't know, police officer should have done this. You get the idea. But again, should, under what theory? Because you personally think this is the way it, in quotes, should be done. So that makes it in concrete for everyone. I don't think so. I don't think so. And that's one of the issues we wrestle with. Again, Who is the arbiter of all of this stuff? Where do we draw these lines and under what theory? Just because something is legal, and let's short circuit that one early on, just because something is legal doesn't mean it's, in quotes, and whatever this might mean, the right thing to do. Women didn't have the right to vote. It was legal. Rhetorical question, was it the right thing to do? The historical sin of the nation, was it the right thing to do? It was legal at some point. Was it the right thing to do? And again, we can create this cascade of instances and events and points in history that, looking back, especially with hindsight through a different prism than apparently society had at the time, we can justify, not justify, cast judgment as to good, bad, right, wrong, etc. But it does come down very much to the notion of, who's the arbiter of all of these things? Is it, in quotes, good? Is it, in quotes, right to disenfranchise a group to the benefit of another group? And if the answer is sometimes or under some theory, what are those theories? And you see where we go with this, and it becomes very complicated very quickly. So simplistic, clear decisions sometimes don't do justice, but become necessary, because otherwise we end up in one of these non sequitur or circular arguments that, could go round and round for decades. Conventional approach to business ethics, well, it involves a comparison of a decision or practice to prevailing societal norms. Well, ethical relativism, something that was wrong today was right years ago, and perhaps the reciprocal of that as well. So, for example, and don't go writing your Congress, people, I'm using this as an example. I'm old, you can see the gray. 40 years ago, it was not necessarily an unkind thing to say, to look at a colleague in the office and say, hey, nice outfit, you look hot today. Try saying that today. Because if you're a guy, you're a misogynistic, you know, self-serving pig, you know the list better than I. And this is one of those ethical relativist perspectives that says, look, I'm not going to pretend to tell you what's right or what's wrong, but society has cast judgment on things. Certain phrases we can't use, certain jokes we can't tell, certain words we can't utter. Now, is it right? Is it wrong? Is it good? Is it bad? These are complicated issues. And it may seem entirely intuitive to say, well, because if you say this or use that phrase, someone is hurt by that. That's not the end of the argument, you know. And I'm not taking a position here. You believe whatever you need to believe, whatever helps you sleep nights. But there is an offset to that, and that is and I hate the way it's phrased, but I'll use the way it's commonly phrased, the free speech argument. So, whose rights take precedent? The right not to be injured by a phrase, or the right to be able to speak freely? Which one trumps which one? What are the theories that support that? Who makes the decision? In other words, who's the arbiter of that? And society has ruled in very many ways on a lot of this stuff. Now, again, is it right? Is it wrong? Is it good? Is it? You ask 10 people, you probably get 10 different answers. But this is the argument that underscores the notion of ethical relativism. So what's right today may not have been right yesterday. What's right today may not be right tomorrow. And that creates quite a conundrum. These norms that we seem to apply, that seem to change, that are kind of relative to society and a point in time, and who's pissed off at whom, and who feels wronged by whom, and who's the victim, and you get the notion. Um, well, the inputs really are fellow workers and, all the stuff. I don't have to read this to you, but all the stuff you see on the slide here: friends, family, the law, religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, society in the aggregate, different professions, and so forth. And all of this comes into play in what is sometimes referred to as our collective, but uh, individually, on an individual basis, our individual conscience as well. So the collective conscience of society at a moment in time, but also based on and built around the notion of the individual conscience of all of us. Ethics and the law. The law often represents an ethical minimum. Ethics often represents a standard that exceeds the legal minimum. And we've used a couple of examples: women's right to vote and so forth. So we do have to reconcile that as well. Making ethical judgments. Well, here again, value judgments and perceptions of the observer play into prevailing norms of acceptability and behaviors or acts that have been committed. And then there's this comparative analysis that goes on. So we overlay values. Whose values? Well, it can be anyone's values: our personal values, our belief structures, something we learned in some forum somewhere, something that came to us culturally. Hofstede talks about culture and the influences of culture. And it really is, in a very meaningful way, programming of the mind. And that's what plays into this idea of ethical judgments and judgment making to a great extent. And we'll talk more about that. This is that Venn diagram that, and I'll just speak to the arguably an economic responsibility, an ethical responsibility, and a legal responsibility are probably some bare minimums for business. And if we overlay the circles. I just love Venn diagrams. But if we overlay the circles, we end up with this sweet spot in the middle. And that area is the area of profitable, legal, and ethical. So that's the area we ought to be seeking. The different areas that we see, 2A, 2B, and 3, and so forth, have different perspectives. But using this idea of a Venn model, if these were the majority inputs, then we would at some point be able to ascertain the area in which we would want to operate, and then catalog what those behaviors and actions might be on somewhat of a consistent or systemic basis. 4 important ethical questions: what is, what ought to be, how do we get from what is to what ought to be, and what is our motivation for acting ethically? And again, at the front end of this, the overriding issue is, who is the arbiter of this? What ought to be? This is, it's the fallacy of shoulds argument. This is what should be. Well, under what theory? We should all have pink shoes in our closet. Okay, I guess. But what's the underlying theory there? So that if there's some National Pink Shoe Day or something, we all have a pair of shoes to wear. Is that what we're talking about? So, we have to be very careful and circumspect when we talk about the transition from what is, because fallacy of shoulds is like Oz. Remember the Wizard of Oz? And if not, watch the movie. It's an old. But in the line, pay no attention to the man behind that curtain, and so forth. Well, what ought to be, what should be. That's like the land of Oz. That's the land of make believe. There's no what ought to be. There's only what is, what exists, what is reality. So, how do we get from what is to what ought to be? Well, assuming that that we're in fact a journey that we were even contemplating. Again, who's the arbiter? What set of rules? How did we arrive at that? And is that a universal prescription for everyone? And then, of course, ultimately, all of that towards the end of what is our motivation for acting ethically? Well, we haven't been able to even define what we mean by acting ethically, other than a whole bunch of non sequitur arguments about what should or what could or what ought to, and what the underlying theories may or may be. Three models of management ethics: immoral management, a style devoid of ethical principles and active opposition to what is ethical. Wow. Um, I could almost be somewhat accepting of that, but for the fact that opposition to what is ethical. Well, what in point of fact is ethical, and how did we arrive at that decision? What is the underlying ethical theory that supports our argument? And this is where, and in the grad class, I would be torturing you a lot more, but underlying moral ethical theories, there are many, and just to name a couple, one is referred to as ethical egoism. And ethical egoism basically says, and this is kind of a jargony way of saying it, but it kind of says, look, ethically, it's the right thing to do if it's good for me. Ethical egoism, self. So it's good for me, it's the right thing to do. Well, a lot of people believe that, and so forth, and certainly act in that way. Then there's kind of a utilitarian perspective, which kind of translates to the majority good for the majority affected. And we could almost be supportive of that kind of a mob rule or majority rule kind of thing, except that it really sucks to be disenfranchised as part of a minority. By definition, we disenfranchise a minority viewpoint in utilitarianism. Is that really what we intended to do? Is that really something that's ethical? And the point being that there are a whole bunch of moral ethical theories. Cultural relativism is one we talked about, the idea of relativism, and many more. And then there are some that seem to reach into what I'll simply refer to as higher order things. And again, this is not an area to go calling your congressperson or anything, because I'm not poking fun at anything. But some of these seemingly higher order arguments come from the Bible, the Quran, and so forth, where we seem to have what I'll refer to as divine guidance or divine intervention, if you even believe in such a thing. And so when we look to that, which is a bit more abstract, arguably a bit more philosophical, perhaps even myth oriented, it's sometimes easier to make a decision on what's ethical or unethical because we have something clear cut to lean on. So for example, for Christians, and I'm not making any arguments one way or the other, but you have something called the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not do this, 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 this. Well, so it's pretty clear what the behaviors are. Don't do any of this stuff. Why? Well, because at a minimum, it would not be ethical. Okay, well, at least there, we get that causal relationship. It's unethical because it violates, the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Okay, so if you kill somebody, you get the idea. But the point being that not all of us seem to rely on these seemingly higher order philosophies and so forth. And so we're left with the seemingly more mundane moral ethical theories like ethical egoism, cultural relativism, utilitarianism, hedonistic utilitarianism, and so forth. And so we continue to duke it out, the idea of good, bad, right, or wrong, and it becomes increasingly difficult to draw these lines, who is the arbiter and the decision maker of good, bad, right, or wrong, and under what theory or theories. Moral management, while conforms to high standards of ethical behavior, again, a great abstract phrase that sounds good when you say it fast, conforms to high standards of ethical behavior. Do we have any, other than our own personal views, do we have any real idea what this notion of ethical behavior is? Well, it's doing what's right. Right for whom? I encourage you to watch a movie. It's not too long, called Margin Call. I think you'll find it on YouTube. You'll find it on Netflix. I think it's on Prime, Amazon Prime, and so forth, because that's a clear example of right for whom. Amoral management. Intentional does not consider ethical factors. Unintentional, casual, or careless about ethical considerations of business. So again, we see moral, amoral, immoral, and there, I'm not going to read through all of this stuff for you, but we check the boxes with this stuff. Components of corporate social responsibility. Well, again, immoral management, economic responsibility, 3 checks. Legal responsibility, 1 check. Ethical responsibility under a theory of immoral management, well, there is no check. Philanthropic responsibility, 1 check. And you get to see the differences, ultimately leading to the notion that whatever moral management may be, whatever that would ultimately turn out to be, well, that's where you get 3 checks in every box, all the things that matter. Economic responsibility, legal responsibility, ethical responsibility, philanthropic responsibility. In other words, all the right things, quotes, of course. Moral management models, well, you can read this for yourself as well, but immoral management, the idea of stakeholder, you know, thinking, you know, well, this idea of stakeholder management is self-absorbed. Shareholder or stakeholder thinking is rejected. Management is self-absorbed. Stakeholder theory is rejected, not deemed useful, accepts profit maximization model, but does not really pursue it. Well, here again, there is a legal responsibility under the business judgment rule in Western capitalism in the for-profit arena for firms to seek profit maximization. That's the purpose. Now, again, you're not going to see Jamie Dimon come out and say, look, to hell with corporate social responsibility and all this other nonsense. We're simply governed and driven by a profit motive. Well, unless you're incredibly naive, that's the reality. But would you come out and say that in a public? Of course not. You're going to sit back and you're going to blow all the warm smoke that everybody wants to hear. We believe in, DEI, and we believe in, SHT, and we believe, and you get the notion. That's what you say publicly. And again, you can see the differences there between amoral management, where we accept shareholder thinking, number of stakeholders or shareholders is somewhat considered. Instrumental view of shareholder theory prevails, and so forth. And then, of course, moral management, SHT, enthusiastically embraced, blah, 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 blah. So making moral management actionable. Well, some important factors: senior management, it's got to be a top-down thing. And again, that presumes that we understand what moral management is. And if we had some criteria, some specifications, kind of a tick sheet or something, it would be up to senior management to implement this. And as we know, Senior management is not the end all. Who does senior management report to, in a sense? Who does oversight? What is the governance structure? Board of directors. So if the board embraces this kind of stuff, well, then it's up to senior management to implement it. Ethics training, excuse me. I kind of laugh at this. I used to do some of it in my consulting business and so forth. And, at the end of the day, ethics training can be almost anything you want it to be, and most of it is fairly useless. But I think what is helpful is an understanding of ethics, underlying ethical theories, and so forth, because those are things, if for no other reason than nomenclature, we can at least agree on definitions and be able to converse and communicate. And then the idea of self-analysis of the firm. Well, probably the greatest self-analysis comes in the form of financial statements and so forth. Going to pass through these and really kind of get to the end here, but developing moral judgment, external sources of a manager's values. Again, this is what Hofstede would refer to as our programming, cultural programming, philosophical or philosophy perspectives that we've been, enjoined with, religious values, legal values, and professional values. And so these are the primary sources of a manager of the firm's influences, arguably values, but certainly influences. So when we look at decision making and we say, well, how and why? Well, if we look to some of these things, we can start to understand some of the hows and whys. Internal sources, well, again, some of the seemingly higher order things like loyalty, the idea of conformity, performance and results obviously measured in a whole bunch of different ways, but respect for the authority structure. So these are some of the things that would influence a manager's values. So military is a great example, and it's an easy example. Respect for the authority structure. Well, you've got a four-star admiral telling you thus and so. You stand tall, salute, and, yes or no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. And these all probably can be enjoined in longer conversations on the discussion board, but we're starting to run long here, so I want to step through the last couple of slides here. Elements of moral judgment, moral imagination, moral identification and ordering, moral evaluation, tolerance of moral disagreement and ambiguity, integration of managerial and moral competence, and a sense of moral obligation. That's probably the driver right there. It's like one of my students was, lack of a better way to phrase it, was seeking sobriety from several different things readily available on the street, certainly until fentanyl became a big issue. And, in a conversation, he said to me, he said, look, this idea, sense of moral obligation, I have to do this. You have to want to be sober. You have to want to quit this other stuff, and for a whole bunch of reasons, for self-worth, self-respect, family, society, legal, all of these things. And so that applies to this stuff too. You want to have to make the right decisions. You want to, if you don't want to, in quotes, do what's right, whatever that might mean, none of the ethics training on the planet, none of the textbooks, none of the PowerPoints or anything is going to make a difference. You have to at heart be looking to do, in quotes, the right thing. May not be clear what that right thing is. It's a bit abstract, but you actually have to have that heart, that willingness to want to do that kind of stuff. And then the elements of moral judgment, and you get the list of moral versus amoral managers and so forth. Last slide. These are the terms that we've referred to and can refer to, and you can seek in your textbook. Let me stop share. I was going to chat a little bit more about some of this stuff, but again, we ran very long and the videos start to, get to the point where you can't put them up if they get too long. So I'm going to cut this short, be back with another, but I hope you'll review this, go over some of this stuff and some of the things that are covered here. I hope you'll refer to in your textbook topically. With that, I'm going to stop share and end this. Thanks very much for watching.